All right, guys, it's time for the Next Level Guy Show, a men's interview, interest, and improvement-focused podcast featuring interviews with the greats from all industries to help you better your life. Each week, a new episode features an interview with one of the greats, covering all aspects of their story, from life hacks to tips and protocols that have allowed them to live life on the next level. We then highlight concrete action steps that you can use to improve your life. And now, your host, Ian Dawson Mackay.
Today's guest is Mark Beaumont. Mark is an athlete, broadcaster, and ambassador. He's best known for cycling around the globe in under 80 days, but there's so much more to the man than that. Using a decade of world firsts, he redefines the meaning of endurance and what we're capable of. He uses these inspiring stories to help businesses and people perform better. Mark's documentaries, events and books about ultra endurance and adventure have taken audiences to over 100 countries and seen by millions. Outside of sport and broadcasting, Mark is a father, business ambassador, as well as a speaker. He's worked with a number of charities and educational organisations as well. And in this interview, we discuss his story about him being the guy who cycled around the world, the preparation and determination that took, what it taught him about what we can achieve in life, how you can prepare for your own challenge, how to build self-resilience and belief in yourself, and how you too can achieve your dreams by just getting going. And now, let's get to the interview. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Mark. I really appreciate it. Now, for people who are maybe not familiar with your name, could you just give a quick intro? Because you've done some amazing things, but how would you describe who you are and why you're so well known?
Well, I mean, I think regardless of what I do with the rest of my life, I'll be known as that guy that cycled around the world a couple of times. And you know what? There's worse things to be known for. Um, I've spent the last 15 years doing professional expeditions. I'm definitely known for trying to do firsts and fastest. So I'm an adventure athlete in a hurry, and I'm often criticised for spoiling a good journey by going too damn fast. But but you know, there's always the kid inside me that's just wanted to really figure out what I'm capable of, whilst having that sort of hunger to that wanderlust to explore the world. So yeah, in the last 15 years, since I graduated from Glasgow University, I've got a perfectly useful economics and politics degree. I've traveled to over 130 countries, made films with the BBC, CNN, GCN, lots of other networks, and written 4 books. I do a huge amount of events and conferences. And the other side of my life, I always joke I spend half my life in a suit, half my life in lycra. I'm a partner in an early stage investment fund. I've got a keen interest in entrepreneurship, and you know, the lesser known side of what I do is sort of trying to nurture talent, put teams together, and build businesses. And there's more commonality for me than you might expect, because it's all about building teams and building performance. But people only really know me for riding a bicycle.
I mean, that was what was really interesting, was when I did research for you, there was a lot of, you immediately assume people are just going to talk about like how many punchers did you have and stuff like that. But I was really impressed at the way that you talked about the performance. You looked at like the definition of success of the true motivation and the inspiration. And you talked a lot about the broadcasting side of it, as much as like what the cycling was a metaphor to you kind of thing. I mean, you grew up in Scotland like I do, and you were raised on a farm and you were homeschooled. Do you think that side of you created that wanderlust, that want to kind of get out and see the world, and it, coming from Scotland, the resilience of it as well, kind of made you want to go out and view the world?
I think the homeschooling part, the fact that I didn't really socialize until I was 12. I went from the foothills of the Highlands in rural Perthshire on a little goat farm, doing subjects around the kitchen table with my 2 sisters, to a school that was 30 miles away with 1,200 kids, at the age of 12. So that's a huge readjustment, and pretty tough for any kid if you've just lived on the farm. So I guess what I already had by that point was a great sense of independence. I didn't mind being on my own. I'm not an introverted person. I'm not particularly, I don't crave that solitude, but I'm also, those formative years, I was very happy in my own head, my own space. So, yeah, that I've always sort of felt that my advantage is not, thinking I'm the world's best bike rider or, athlete. It's having the quiet confidence to take on these projects that other people haven't thought of, or trying to do them in different ways. So I think the formative stuff for me was just having the freedom of mind and the backing of my mum in particular to just take stuff on. There was no reference point around me for what the norm was. Like, I wasn't in a playground environment where people went, "This is cool, that's not, do this, don't do that."
Mm.
And I was never like, when you're 4, 5, 6, and you're told that those shoes are cool and those ones aren't. That sort of starts to ingrain a conformality, like a sense of, I need to fit in. Whereas, I'm not a rebel, but equally I've never really bothered about any of that, because by the time I was in high school, if I had an idea, I just did it. And do you know what? That trait takes you a long way. So yes, to go back to your question, of course I've had wanderlust from an early age. Of course, growing up in Scotland, what an extraordinary adventure playground to then go off and, explore the planet. But really, it came from that quiet confidence just to go, do you know what? I've got an idea. And then, I was a kid when I started. So I was 12 when I pedaled across Scotland, 15 when I cycled long Land's End, John O'Groats. By the time I was 18, I was crisscrossing Europe. So, I never grew up going, I'm going to cycle around the world once, let alone twice. But looking back at the age of 37, there's a very clear chronology. Like, in terms of confidence and skill set, one project quite clearly leads to the next. But you can only see your life like that in retrospect. You can't see it, as a 12-year-old kid going, what do I want to be when I grow up? You just have to build that, yes, keep that kid inside, always keep that sort of, that entrepreneurial spark, that sort of, oh, what's possible? That trying to figure out your personal best has always been, you never, I've got 2 children of my own now, and you really try and nurture that imagination and make it more than just thoughts. Just do it. If you've got an idea, do it. You might fail, you might hurt yourself, but you'll learn from it. And that is such an advantage.
Because that's something I was really impressed with when I was listening to other sort of media with you, was that you don't just sit there and say, this is what I did on a daily basis, this is what I trained. You kind of looked at like how what it's possible, what you could achieve, and how the definition of success and how you could then create that goal. I mean, I really like the way that you set your goal setting, for example, as you looked at what you could possibly do, not what needed to be done, but to have the outer sort of limits that you could push yourself through. And very few people do that. And I think I like that idea of like not having that knowledge of, not being able to conform because you hadn't had that restrictions of a lot of the BS story that we get put on us at that age. Do you think everybody listening needs to do a challenge like this? Like I was speaking to Jay Morton earlier. Do you think everybody should climb their own Everest or cycle around the world? Is that what a lot of people are missing in their life? Is a challenge that kind of really pushes them outside that comfort zone, do you think?
I definitely think that experiences in the outdoors are massively formative. You know, the way you are physiologically in the great outdoors, how your senses take in the world, the sights, the sounds, the wind in your hair. You know, I am no scientist, I'm not an academic in that sense, but, I can tell you over the years, committing to experiences outdoors can be hard because of all the hardship and prep and time and thought to actually commit to something, which can be quite difficult. But I've never ever regretted an experience in the outdoors. Yeah, I've had some real shockers, but ultimately, the most life defining, career defining stuff happens when you're out there. So, I think we're creatures of habit at the end of the day. Your question is, do we need to have those experiences? There's very few other things in life that give us a sense of assurance our limits, just self-awareness, living life with one eye in the mirror, knowing what you're capable of and how to how to deal with different situations than endurance sport, and time spent in the great outdoors. Now, look, there's a huge amount learned from playing rugby, hockey, and team sports, football, whatever your game is. Absolutely, um, but there's something about feats of endurance. Now, the wonderful thing about endurance is it's the great leveler, isn't it? Young, old, male, female. There's not such a great difference. It's not like sprint sports or power sports where you can be born with an ability. The endurance and adventure is a wonderfully broad church, and you do find that people who have had big expedition endurance experience have a different sense of self. Perhaps a bit more composure when they come back into other work or family environments, and you know it's humbling. When you take on these big projects, you put yourself into context in the big wide world, and I'm sure other people would argue that you can get those experiences through art or music or academia, but I'm yet to be convinced that you can get from anything else what you can get from adventure experiences in the wild.
Yeah, because I think it's also like we seem to sort of miss that ritual nowadays. Like because modern society is very sort of easy on us. We no longer have the ritual from childhood to manhood, and I think sometimes we could get through life without really challenging ourselves. And I don't know, is it maybe just a Scottish thing because we always grew up like doing the lambing and chasing sheep and going up hills and stuff like that, and it was like you knew you achieved something from it, or you went out and fed the sheep or whatever kind of thing. There was always some sort of challenge and pushing ourselves each day in the in the wind and the rain and stuff like that. And I think a lot of people miss that because you can order food nowadays, you can order taxis, you can order dates online almost, like these apps and all that kind of stuff. And it's like you're saying, it's we don't have to endure anymore. And I think that's a big part missing about guys. Do you find that's where a lot of guys go wrong? I mean, do you find that that has really helped shape how you view the world, or did you see similarities in like as you visited the different cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is a commonality there. I'm just reflecting on the early part of that question. I mean, I think all people crave the easy life. We're all at our heart of hearts quite lazy. We'd much prefer to, watch telly and lie in bed. If we didn't have those positive experiences, we wouldn't be drawn to, push ourselves, through things which are a lot harder than doing nothing. So, like, it's not like I'm some naturally super motivated person, like anyone, I love a beer and a lion. So, um, what is the draw? What is the hook? It's habit. It's knowing that wonderful feedback loop from putting yourself in difficult places. But I mean, at the start of your question, you were reflecting the part that we're living longer. We're living healthier insofar as the healthcare system looks after us and allows us to avoid a lot of things that really make us suffer. A lot of us go through till midlife without experiencing anyone in our families passing away. So there's no sense of our own mortality for many people. It didn't happen really for me until I, sadly witnessed people dying on expedition. And, of course, like you, I grew up on a farm and I've got that sense of life and death. And, people are so far removed from where their food has come from and so far removed from anything which is, vaguely uncomfortable. Do you go looking for it? No, I don't take on expeditions because I'm some alpha male who just wants to, get back to being Tarzan. But but the reality is, we're fickle creatures. I spend half my life on expedition wishing I was at home with home food and home comforts, and then I spend half my life at home just craving the simplicity and the hardship
Mm.
of my bivy bag and the open road. So we're complicated creatures. The second part of your question, the have I seen that the world over? Yeah, for sure. We're all biased to home. Us Scots like to think we're the most welcoming, wonderful place on the planet. I've, a couple of years back, I went and filmed around the entire Commonwealth, and guess what? That's just home. It's what everyone says about home. And regardless of what other people think of it, that familiarity bias with our own is unbelievably powerful, starting with family, community, our own country, and then the wider world. So I think as human beings, we crave, uh, we think we want a simple, easy life, and we sort of think of a place where we've sort of made it, whether that's financially or, our relationships, or we think there's a never ever land where we're going to turn around and go, oh, all that work was worthwhile and we've made it. And the reality, which is, a harsh reality, is you've never ever, and you have to you have to struggle, not in a sort of a heroic, I'm gladiatorial, I'm out there just to, show the world how tough I am way, but through striving, through dreaming, through being entrepreneurial, through sort of that sort of hunger, we find wonderful satisfaction. We find incredible fulfillment. We find that real sort of fire in our belly through taking on difficult stuff. So, dream for the simple life if you wish, but, I hope you never find it, because I think you'll find yourself very bored. I would encourage everyone to, make themselves uncomfortable as a habit, do things which are difficult. And that's not a hero statement. It's just, creating a life habit out of doing things which, maybe aren't what your mates are doing, just trying stuff which just because it interests you. I remember, I know this sounds daft, but I was doing an internship over in Boston when I was in my early 20s. I was incredibly lucky to be selected to go across and spend a couple of months over there. I was in halls of residence, and I was living with a bunch of mates from Glasgow. And one day I saw an advert that they had this thing called Shakespeare in the Common, Boston Common. And I thought, I don't think nothing about Shakespeare. I'm not a learned reader and of, plays and the rest of it. But I thought, oh, that sounds cool. Sitting out in the sun, watching a bit of Shakespeare, drinking a beer. I thought that sounds cool. And I went back into the common room of the halls we were all staying in. You imagine I'm 21 years old, and I said to everyone that they were about to go out and play football, I said, I saw an advert, I saw a poster for Shakespeare in the Park. Does anyone want to go? And you can just imagine one of the alpha males, one of the stronger characters in the group, just laughed and went, "You want to go and see Shakespeare?" Blah blah blah, and they ribbed me mercilessly. And so everyone else immediately went, "Oh, Mark, what a joke." And I was like, fine. I mean, water off a duck's back, because that's been an early habit from my formative years. And I went, fine. Bought myself a beer and went off and enjoyed an afternoon watching Shakespeare, and I knew nothing about it. And I don't tell you that as some great hero I cycled around the world story. It's just like, at some level, not giving a shit. Like, if you want to do something, do it. And if the world tells you it's not the cool thing to do or it's not the right thing to do, what have you got to lose? And it's fascinating. A few days later, a couple of those mates coming back to me and going, "Well, that sounded really cool. I kind of wanted to do that, but obviously because you were getting laughed at the time, we just went along with the crowd." And then it's a daft anecdote, but that's at the heart of your decisions in life. That's at the heart of just being in the driving seat, not just going through life sort of trying to fit in and not be noticed. People are so worried about tall poppy syndrome. I don't do these things because, I have a look at my social media feeds. I am not a selfie person. I'm not running around going, here I am doing this, here I am doing that. I'm a storyteller. I love going out there, pushing myself and telling stories because it's a wonderful feedback loop. Hopefully, it gives other people the quiet confidence to do things they want to do. They're normally good at riding their bikes or climbing mountains or rowing boats or doing the things they want to do, but it's actually having the gumption to take these projects on. That's a totally different life skill than being physically strong.
Yeah, I mean, that really hit home with me as you were saying it, was that's kind of the reason I started the podcast and wanting to speak to people like yourself, like these top performers, people who have gone off and challenged the norm and really sort of pushed themselves and chased the greatness that you can achieve in life. Because for me, it was very kind of go to the pub, sit with your mates. I didn't really like the conversations. I didn't feel like I was being challenged. I knew there was more to life. And this is what I really hope for this, like these kind of podcasts, is that people kind of get inspired and go, well, all right, and then they pick up the tools and the life hacks that they can then go and implement them and take on their own challenge or their own round the world, whatever it could be. Now, you've talked about setting your goals for each day, which is crazy when I think about it. 240 miles, I think you cycled across Scotland, and you needed to do that for like 16 days straight. How did you work out what was you were truly capable of? Not just so what you had to do to break the record. How did you set the goals of what you as a person could achieve? And really push yourself.
Yeah, so I mean the very quick recap of what the round the world was. I mean the round the world is an 18,000 mile race. So a race just like the round the world sailing race is a race, insofar as there's nobody else out there. I grew up when I was a teenager watching Ellen MacArthur sail around the world, was utterly inspired by that. So it's not like there's lots of other people racing you at the same time, but it's certainly something that lots of people go for over the years. So when I first spotted this back in the day, when was that? 2005, 2006. The record stood at 276 days to get around the world. And, I looked at that and I thought, not being unkind about what had gone before, but like, why is that not being done properly? Like that should be at a whole new level. Not because I thought I was, the best bike rider, just because I thought, well, do the maths, simply do the maths. I thought first time round, if I could ride a century a day, 100 miles a day, then you'd get around the planet in half a year, 180 days, 190, 180 days, 180 days, and then I was adding a day off per fortnight. That's right. I'm trying to think back to what I did 15 years ago. So that was a very crude sum, ride a century a day, which for a lot of like club riders, 100 miles is, it's a decent ride, but it's not nuts. Certainly not if you take all day about it. So when I was 22, 23 and I set out around the world the first time, that was it. Can I ride 100 miles a day? So I came back and broke the previous world record by a matter of months, because I came back in 194 days and the record was 276. And that blew people's mind, so not just breaking a record by a couple of days, but months. The BBC documentary that followed launched my career. And then I went on and spent the next 10, plus years doing lots of other expeditions. So when I came back to it, I've got all that experience. I've now got a professional team around me. I'm going fully supported rather than unsupported. And I really put some science behind the ambition. That's when we looked at what's the minimum sleep I can get away with, what's the optimal time spent on the bike, what's the longest sets I can ride. So the inputs to a ride are sleep, ride time, food, and hydration. Those are 4 inputs. So rather than just looking at the world record that stood, which was now 123 days, and going, well, how do I beat that? It was proper bottom-up planning. Like, what are my inputs every day that are sustainable, that will stack up to my personal best? So with due respect to Andrew Nicholson and the record that went before, I was never trying to break that record. I was trying to figure out what the art of the possible was. And it was a totally different record as well, because I had a big support team this time. It was like Tour de France style riding, but doing much bigger distances and for 2.5 months. I had chef, performance manager, logistics manager, media crew. I mean, it was a big budget, fully professional expedition. So when we got down in the planning to about 88, 89 days, I then put it back to my sort of researchers and logistics team, and I said, hang on a second. Are you saying you think we can go sub 90? How about 80? So when we got in the planning, that proper bottom up planning down to less than 90 days, I sort of, the romantic notion around the world in 80 days, the 1873 fiction book, is that possible? So I sort of put it back to them as a hypothesis. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Because if around the world in 80 days didn't exist as a concept, I would have never thought to have taken that on. If it didn't exist, I would have quite happily settled at the planning that my team had done and got me down to, 88, 89 days. But because I then sort of gave it back to them as that sort of that dream, we then worked out how to do that. So it was that 2-stage approach of what do we think is practically possible, and then trying to stretch that. And it's interesting to reflect because, I was out my scratcher at 3:30 every morning, on the bike at 4, riding 4 times 4-hour sets, getting 5 hours a night sleep, back up at 3:30 on the bike at 4, every single day for 2.5 months. So you've got to do 75 days riding, 3 days flights, 2 days contingency to get around the entire planet in less than 80 days. So that is a unbelievably tight race insofar as you've got 12 hours of contingency per continent. I mean, you can lose 12 hours at an airport with a delay or a border crossing. 12 hours is nothing when you're talking about going from Paris to Beijing in 28 days on leg one. I mean, you're
Mhm.
going 1,000 miles every 4 days. So if you mess up in any given 4 hour block, it's going to be pretty hard to make it back over the 80 days. So it was a massive, massive stretch target. We broke the world record by 37%. And people thought we were nuts. When I set out, people were like, well, we love the ambition. Of course, we get the 80 days dream, but, there's just no reference point for this. Nobody in the history of cycling has tried anything close to this. And that brought a lot of negativity, a lot of doubt. And that's when you've got to be pretty keen on your own gremlins. Like, you imagine there's 40 people working for me across this project. And, they're amazing. They're brilliant. They're doing stuff that I couldn't possibly do, but they're still looking to me for that sort of emotional leadership. Like if I look worried, they look worried. If I smile, they smile, and I'm acutely aware of that when I get on my bike at 4 o'clock every morning. And even though you might feel like crap and you've barely slept and you've got another 250 miles to ride that day, you've got to somehow show your team that you still believe in the plan and believe in them. And that's a lot more than being fit. That's a lot more than just the athletic part. I'm 6'3" and 90 kilos. I'm not the world's best bike rider. Power to weight ratio, performance on the bike. There's a ton of riders out there that could kick my arse. But when it comes to ultra endurance, that level of belief and discipline around the plan and getting the right people around work around you, that's a much more complicated model than just, you know, a race which lasts a day and you just have to go all guns blazing and, the fastest guy gets to the finish. That consistency, that ability to suffer, that ability to deal with sleep deprivation and the pressure of a race that lasts 2.5 months. Yeah, there's you've got to have done stuff in your life that prepares you for that. It's you can't just fall out of bed and do that, without experience.
Because that's definitely something that comes across in the sort of documentaries, and that is the how good a support team that you had. You had like the mechanic, the performance manager, and things like that. But you've said that you picked the team more than just based on their technical ability. How did you go about creating that support team? And what did it teach you about sort of leadership and building that kind of relationships? Because you basically stayed in an RV when you're sleeping or cycling with them. You relied on them to keep you moving, the logistics of your travel, etc. What did you look for in picking your team members? Because you said yourself that you wouldn't be able to have done this without them. But what advice, would you give to people for creating such a great support team?
I mean, when you sort of build a structure like that, so a lot of people based athletic plans and business plans on just let's beat what we did last year or let's beat what the competition's doing. Let's beat what the competition doing is the classic mistake that almost every athlete in business makes, as opposed to proper bottom up planning. What is possible? What's the art of the possible? How do you actually define this on our own terms, and then having the quiet confidence to actually stick to that rather than just sort of fall back to, oh well, as long as we beat the competition, we've won. Um, so that for me is the difference between absolute success and comparative success. Absolute success is success on your own terms, and I explain that off the bat because you need a team that can buy into that as well. So we won't go into the geeky side of that, but in broad brushstrokes, it's very easy to get people who are well qualified. It's very easy to get people who have um, worked for impressive organizations. And the thing I care most about is behavior and behavioral change under pressure, like really knowing how people think, how they communicate, and how they act under pressures. Because that sequence of events under sleep deprivation, financial stress, you know, angst amongst the teams, just uncertainty, how you deal with stress. How are you you turn the heat up? First of all, it sort of clouds the mind. It brings in your blinkers. It changes the way you perceive the world. It stops you being objective and collaborative. Then, of course, it changes the tone and the manner of your communication. That ability to remain open, remain pragmatic, remain collaborative. And then lastly, your actions. If you don't get the first two things right, if you can't keep an even emotional keel, your actions fundamentally change. So if I was to think of the people who left the project, it was never because they weren't technically good. They hadn't been on the courses, knew what to do. It was always because of the behavioral change under pressure, that reliability part. And um, it's pretty hard to define without giving you examples. But, when I rode the Atlantic back in 2012, we capsized and nearly died after 28 days of rowing. So we were into Caribbean waters, thought we'd done it, and then went upside down. Long story short, but most of the crew never left the safety cell of the life raft. So once we were sort of, capsized, paddled around for an hour trying to sort our stuff out, got into the life raft, and then even though we knew what was needed to survive, we were just going to float around until, we perished anyway. We had to do a whole bunch of stuff. Get back in the water, swim, dive, grab our, EPIRB, SAT, flares, emergency kit, go through all the training we'd been through in emergency situations. But fundamentally, there was an assumption with over half of the crew that somebody else would do it. It was unspoken. It had never been clear until we were under that degree of pressure. But it was just this assumption that regardless of physical or mental ability or training, that somebody else would be more able or more willing to do what was necessary. And it really taught me the difference between knowing what to do and doing it. So, I mean, you can interview people and they'll tell you amazing stories about the companies they've worked for and the projects they've been involved in. These days, I'm much better at asking, what did you do? Don't tell me you worked for Apple or Nike or you worked at the Olympics or like, wow, that's really impressive. What did you actually do? And tell me about some stuff which was, really high pressure and difficult. And if people sort of stutter and slow down and start to not be able to explain themselves, it's pretty clear that they've not been in those situations where they've had the clarity of thought to be able to do those things. So take the capsize in the Atlantic. If you said to all 6 of the crew, tell me about a time when the shit hit the fan, they'd tell you an amazing story about capsizing the Atlantic and surviving. And you would sort of place on them all sorts of amazing character traits around grit, resolve, resilience, you'd employ them on the moment because you think, my God, you've been through something which was so tough and yet you came through it. That doesn't for a moment tell you what they were thinking, what they were communicating, and what they actually did. You need to say, okay, crikey, capsizing the Atlantic, that must have been incredibly tough. Tell me about it. What happened? What was the process? Okay, the capsize is awful, but what did you do? Oh, I closed my eyes and prayed for 14 hours. Ah, right, that's what you did. Because, within that story, that thing which immediately impresses you, you need to be very, very careful not to impart to people, things that you want to hear. I'm so acutely aware when I'm speaking to people now of not having that bias for them, not sort of assuming things on their behalf, not sort of thinking, of course I want to think the best of people, but I used to be a lot more generous. I used to be, somebody would start telling me about who they were and where they'd come. We can all think of those first meetings with people. And then you try and sort of build around them a very positive story. And it's not like I'm trying to strip people of anything they're deserved, but I really listen carefully. Like, is that bullshit? Is that a story that you were told? Were you there? Or, and also just through the stories people tell you, just get a real understanding of what are they not saying? Like, what part did they play in? Do they need to tell me that story? Like, is there a reason they're telling me that, or does that show something else about their character, or their need to be known, or their confidence or lack of? Crikey, we're all human. We've all got mental health. We've all got the need to be liked and to like others. So, this is a complicated world that we're talking about here. But the thing I think I've become much better at over the years is just really listening to people and understanding what they're saying, not necessarily what the words are, and not necessarily what they're trying to put across, because quite often what people are trying to sell you is not the real deal, whether they're over egging the pudding or they're not telling you something that's important. So the bit which I've become really keen at, whether it's on the businesses that I help or the performance teams I put together, is just really trying to understand people and then nurture talent, absolutely give people opportunities, but never at the cost of the overall project. So, you're allowed to bring on talent, promote people, take risks, give people accountability and responsibility, but no deadwood. Okay, so anything which becomes a brake on progress, cut it out, make changes, get rid of people, and I'm really, really clear on that. I'm it's so easy to just, when something derails your life, your project, your work, then you have to react. In crisis situations, most of us are actually pretty good, because it's that fight or flight. Shit, I have to do something because my livelihood depends on it, or my life depends on it. So people are surprisingly good under that sort of real stark pressure. Leaders are less good under sort of things which I just call breaks on progress, stuff which is just not quite right. It's the conversations around the water cooler. It's the things which are, you know, the negativity, or the lack of productivity, or lack of accountability, which is just annoying. But ultimately, it's not gonna ruin everything. It's just not quite optimal. Well, those little things over long periods become very big things. Take my idea of, if you mess around every 5 minutes when you get off the bike, going around the planet, that led a day to the world record. So take that same analogy and put it to people in your team. If people are all pointing in the right direction, bought into the same plan, yeah, they can make mistakes and they can have their own ideas and they've got that independence. But ultimately, if there's even small things which are not right in terms of what the team are trying to do, you know, if people make mistakes, fine. Bring them back, learn from it. That's part of life. But if people are ultimately not bought into what you're trying to do and continue to be a brake on progress, cut them out. And I've seen that mistake made so many times over the years, where people just, they're too nice. They adapt. They learn to live around it. Nobody wants to have the difficult conversations, and that's something you got to learn if you want to be successful.
It's time for a quick break. There are millions of potential products to buy, so how do you know which ones are worth your hard-earned money? Simple. You go to nextlevelguy.com/affiliates and explore those that will transform and improve your life. You'll find deals, listener exclusives, and special offers with some great companies. Recommendations are 100% honest and only on items Ian has tried or believes in. The companies showcased will make you a better man in all areas of your life. Simply go to nextlevelguy.com/affiliates and level up.
I love that, because it's usually what they're not saying. It's like everybody's always got a way of them being the hero in the story. And a lot of times you can kind of go, you just push into it a wee bit and they crumble. And yeah, I mean, we all have this kind of way of like retelling stories to make ourselves look better. And was that the initial plan, was to find these people that would then just let you control the controllables? Would just allow you to get on the bike, you knew what you had to do and do it, and they would take care of, logistics and fixing things and, cleaning the bike and all that sort of stuff. How was it sort of set up? Did you just focus solely on just getting on the bike each day and riding? And how did you build up the resilience for this? Is it just the same as going and training and getting the miles in, so you have these reference points to then, to use, so you know what to anticipate, you know what to expect? How do you even start planning and training for something like this?
I mean, I'm not taking away from the physical part. To be able to ride an average of 400 kilometers a day, just shy of, so about 240 miles a day, for 2.5 months is a huge physical task. Of course it is. But most athletes going into big expeditions over focus on training. So that's all they see. And most expeditions, in my experience over the last 15 years, don't get to the start line because the athlete's not very good at fundraising, or not very good at putting the right team together, or not good at sort of doing all the logistics and mitigating the challenges, down the road, border crossings, whatever it is. So, yes, physical training is massively important, and that's a podcast conversation in itself, isn't it? In terms of how the hell you train for something of like an 18,000 mile race. But the at the heart of your question is, I'd spent a lot of my early years in expedition doing solo unsupported expeditions. So I know we've talked a lot about cycling, but climbing, mountaineering, a lot of skiing trips. We've touched on some of the ocean rowing, Arctic stuff. Um, Quite a lot of these trips were self-supported. When I cycled 9 months down the length of the Americas, or even the length of Africa, the Cape Town world record. These are all trips where ultimately it's proper adventure. You know, some of them are borderline sort of like explorer territory, especially Arctic. I would never call cycling around the world explorer territory because you're following a ribbon of tarmac. But my point is that the real adventure is everything that happens off the bike, off the boat. It's the people, the places, the cultures, the food, where you're going to sleep every night, where's your next clean water and safe meal. That sense of having to find your way through is what makes it an expedition as opposed to just a feat of sports. Um, so I kind of knew from all that experience that to be able to take it to its nth degree, to the ultimate for me is the world, the circumnavigation. I said before I wondered why it wasn't as coveted and as professional as the round the world sailing record. And so I always knew if I was going to come back for one big prize, it was going to be the world. And I thought, if I'm going to do that and literally leave no stone unturned, it's not a world record for how quickly you can pitch your tent. It's a world record for how fast you can ride your bike around the planet. So I had to have everyone else doing everything else. I had to focus on the one core skill set, which the record was about, which is racing my bike. So, you lose a ton of time, stopping in Pakistani restaurants waiting for your lunch to be cooked, or, all the faff and faddle that comes with, a proper unsupported expedition. I love that, but you're not going to go that fast. So, to go around the world in 80 days, you need to find an amazing team who can take care of all the other component parts. So Laura Penhall, my performance manager, she's been at 4, maybe 5 Olympics and Paralympics, on the support side. So absolute top of her game in terms of working with athletes and para athletes. In her own light, she led the first all-female crew to row the Pacific Ocean. So she led a 9-month expedition rowing from California to Australia. I mean, properly hardcore. Um, so I needed people of that caliber who could basically take the reins and do a lot more than I could ever do. So Mike Griffiths, my logistics manager, military career, run races with Race Across America for years and years and years, had that just discipline around logistics and team management, which again, you don't want to be worrying about when you're on the bike. All you can do when you're riding the bike is ride the road in front of you. You can't be sort of thinking about the next border crossing or what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time. You need other people in your team to have that level of objectivity. So it's difficult for me, isn't it? Because it's my project. I raised the best part of £1 million to make this happen. And then to then hand over the reins and just say, look, I'm just a guy on the bike now. If, you know, if I fail, everyone fails, but I can't do this on my own. And that's so important because if I try and dictate and control this project from the bike, it'll fail. So that takes a huge, and actually, so I did a 3,000-mile training ride around the coastline of Britain, London to London via the coast, just before I left. And then there was 9 weeks recovery between the around Britain and the world. And that was meant to sort of test the plan, test the team, make sure we're ready. And then there was sort of a process in place to me hand over the reins in those 9 weeks so that by the time we got to Paris, I wasn't in charge. Now, of course, people still looked at me for that sense of reassurance. I alluded to it before, that sort of emotional leadership is the one part you'll never delegate. You might try to, but trust me, if it's your idea and you've employed people, if you smile, everyone smiles. It was funny when we got to Alaska, Mike Griffiths turned to me and said, we've got a problem in the team because one of the crew is threatening to go home. He's threatening to leave. I said, why? And he said, oh, because he's really intimidated. He's not enjoying it, and he's just finding it too tough. All the way across Australia and New Zealand, it'd been utterly relentless. It'd been so hard to stay on schedule through the winter, the southern hemisphere, the dark, it was just brutal. A lot had gone wrong. Cleared the length of New Zealand in 5 days, and I turned around to Mike and I said, right, obviously I can't wade in at this point. I've very much delegated these responsibilities, and you just undermine the responsibility you've tried to create if you then get stuck back in and try and call the shots. So I said, like, obviously that's unacceptable, Mike. Who's intimidating him, what's going wrong, let's give him the reassurance he needs. And Mike quietly turned to me and he said, it's you, Mark. And I said, what do you mean? I'm a nice guy. Like, what have I done? And he said, no, you're really intense. And I understand that, with my military background and my life experience. Laura and a lot of the team understand it. We can absolutely take it at face value. But one of the guys, he might look tough, but he doesn't have the same life experience. And that critical feedback and that daily pressure and that constant drive. He said, he's super intimidated. He's about to get on a plane. And I really had to take, a moment on the bike and thought, bloody hell, what have I done? What have I said? Because there was me trying to not control the project, not make the decisions, not ask anyone to do anything. And yet, just through my behavior every day and my intensity, there was somebody, super intimidated and about to leave the project. And I had no idea that my body language and the things I wasn't saying could have that effect on people. It's really interesting.
It is strange how like some people can misinterpret what you say or what you mean, or they can read in readings behind things, and it's true what you say. It's like we forget that not everybody has that same level of experience as ourselves, or the person on the phone to our business or whatever it is isn't the same person that you're not speaking to yourself, and that a lot of times they're doing it by their own biases and their own upbringing and how they've been affected. And I think that's something we do forget with our interpersonal relationships. And how did you find afterwards when you had done these sort of challenges? How then did it sort of change your view of the world and sort of interactions with people? You know, do you find now that we're quarantined, for example, that you're getting pretty bored with just sitting in at home? Do you feel this sort of longing to want to go off and do something now?
No, I love it. I mean, it's been a really tough, what is it, 11, 12 weeks?
Uh,
I love it insofar as I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, my wife. I live in Edinburgh. I've worked very hard for 15 years, and it's pretty devastating to watch 80-90% of the work you've got planned for the year just disappearing. I've had a successful little business for a decade and a half, and through no fault of my own, it's just fallen off a cliff. So that is quite scary. But I'll never regret the time it's given me with my kids. I'm somebody who's typically spends half my life on the road, and it's given me time to create some other projects. And I don't feel sorry for myself because, my goodness, you just need to look around you to see how hard this is hitting a lot of people. And I guess the habit that I'm used to from a very early age is going, right, let's do this. Let's create an opportunity. Let's pivot. Let's go out there, sell, build finance, build teams. I've done it my entire life, so it's pretty devastating when my bread and butter is events, conferences, working with businesses, jumping on planes and trains and traveling the world and making films. I can't do any of that, and it's not going to come back overnight. So for the next year and a half, you know, I've got the opportunity to do other stuff. So do I have that wanderlust to get out there and make more films and travel? Yeah, absolutely. But it's given me the opportunity to do some stuff which, I'll never regret. As you can probably tell, I'm a very process-driven person. So I was listening to a podcast, actually the Rick Roll podcast, when he was talking to Rich Roll, when he was talking to the chap who ran across America and then decided to run every street in San Francisco, and his name has gone straight out of my head. Gareth Evans, it might be. And
I think something like that, yeah.
anyway, every street San Francisco, I would encourage you to look it up. It's a fantastic little project, and I was inspired by it. I listen to podcasts a lot, and I thought, I could do that in Edinburgh with my daughter. So for the last 43 days, we've gone out, for an hour every day, which is what you're allowed to do. And she's on a bicycle, age 6. I'm ran a 10, 15K, however far it takes me. And we've mapped out the whole of Edinburgh. I think Edinburgh is 80 10K runs. And by the time she goes back to school after the summer, she'll have cycled every cul-de-sac, every lane, every roundabout of Edinburgh. And, as a project father and daughter, that's such a lot of fun. We look forward to it every day. She writes a journal about it, and, she's building great skills through doing it. I looked around me and I was like, okay, well, business is a bit shit right now, but, I want to feel like I've had some connection with the wider challenge which is going on with coronavirus and COVID. So can I create an event? Can I do something which supports those that need it most right now? So I was listening to Sir Tom Hunter chatting to Chris Evans on the radio, and he was talking about getting money to where it was needed most. This was about 6 weeks ago, and I thought, that sounds great. So I can create an event. I just need to talk to somebody like Sir Tom, who knows where the money's needed to go. So I got in touch with him. He told me the best way to coordinate any fundraising. Got put in contact with a few other people who could help me organize it. 5 days later, we ran our first event, and over 4 weeks raised £231,000. And built a community of cyclists and rowers across the UK who were doing miles at home and, putting in some incredible shifts. We called the event World in a Day, and just, the fundraising's fantastic. But what's even more powerful for me is that sense of community, camaraderie, doing something positive at a period when you could so easily just put your head in the sand and wish time away. So, you know, for me, it's about, there's a lot to bemoan right now, but you don't want to just sort of wish it didn't happen and feel sorry for yourself. You just want to sort of do something which makes this period, positive. And I always think if you start to feel sorry for yourself, just get the arrows pointing the other way. Just do something for other people, talk to other people, get some perspective. And as I say, doing something meaningful with my daughter, or building a community of fundraisers for a month, that's the best thing I've done in lockdown. The business, that'll be fine. It's not cheery, but if all I'd done in the last 10 weeks was worry about work, I certainly wouldn't be very happy.
I mean, and that's the thing that'll shape her future and make her a better person, and that'll be the thing that she remembers most. From her childhood, is that kind of interactions. And I think that sometimes is entrepreneurs or men in general, we tend to kind of focus on, oh, let's make money, let's get the best car, and we get into this BS kind of comparison stuff and where we are in our jobs, and then sometimes it's actually about the stories we're building with people, our interactions. It's the experiences that we have with people, and it took me a long time to realize that it was more experiences and what happened in it, rather than what you got out of something. And it took me getting made redundant and stuff like that. And I think it's a difficult one to explain to a younger guy, but I think it's, as you get older, you kind of realize the importance in giving back. I mean, do you think more now that it's the joy of telling the story, it's the joy of the experience and the broadcasting of it, more than just getting the record and the cycling and that sort of thing? Was that the kind of the appeal of it, that they gave you a camera and allowed you to share your story of it?
I mean, since I was 22, 23, it's always been a part of it. So I've never been an athlete without being a storyteller. Now, being brutally honest, when I first went on that round the world back in 2007, I had no ambition to be on telly or to write books or the rest of it. I didn't like writing at school and university, and I hadn't grown up with a telly. So it just wasn't part of my motivation. I did it as an economics graduate. It was a purely sort of the utility of the fact that I needed to get sponsors. I needed to thank my sponsors. I spent half a year telling the sponsors that I would get telly, and that same half year telling telly companies I'd get it sponsored. So it was a very commercial, decision at the age of 21, 22, going, I need telly because I need to somehow give return on investment to my sponsors. So again, to spoil the romance of it, I went into this just in very practical terms, going, what gives me the means to do these things? And then I met an amazing man called David Peat, a great late friend of mine. We lost him about 6, 7 years ago. And he was a legend in the Scottish filmmaking documentary world. But he took me under his wing for the last sort of 6 years of his career. We traveled the world together, made films, and he shared with me that real passion for storytelling, for people. He had such a childlike interest, and he had such a wonderful way of speaking with people and finding out stories. And the camera gives you wonderful access. It really does more than a tourist would ever get. It allows you places, and people are incredibly candid when they know it's for some reason going to be filmed and shared. So it's a real privilege, it's a real responsibility, it's something I absolutely love. And it's not for the ego of it, but I wouldn't go on a journey now if I didn't get to film it. I love that. I get a lot from it.
So, what did you learn during that times? About when like the boat capsized, and you realised that sort of people weren't willing to try save themselves, or you got the time you got like puncture after puncture and stuff like that. And then, I mean, you talked about speaking to a therapist after coming back from that rowing trip. You've talked about like the challenges and the resilience and dealing with emergencies. But what's it taught you about learning to deal with that? And dealing with problems and stuff like that. Has it changed since you've become a father? Has that, do you think it's helped you become a better father?
um I think there's definitely things I wouldn't do now that I did in my 20s. People go around talking about dangers and risks, but I always talk about exposure, which simply means how likely are things to go wrong, and if they do go wrong, how serious are the consequences. So, I've got a pretty good way of analyzing risk these days, which I think is a useful toolkit to have because it stops you running around being scared of shadows. I'm a pretty practical person. I wouldn't be scared of something just because I've not done it before. The ability to analyze something at face value and decide its risk profile and your exposure, and I think that is a useful toolkit. I think the thing that it fundamentally changes for me as a father is the responsibility to impart and share as much experiences with them as I can. So by the time they have their own independent, bold ideas, they've got a toolkit to make up their own mind. So I'm certainly not a protective parent. I'm certainly not somebody who's saying you're not old enough. And of course, there's limits. But what I'm saying is, I want to get out there and do as much as possible, experience the big bad world in all its grit and glory. And, by the time they're 15, 16, 17, and they're saying, I want to do X, Y, and Z, it might be in sport, it might not be, it doesn't really matter. They've got enough self awareness. So, at the root of your question is, what's it given me? I think it's given me, a better sense of self, assurance, knowing that you can deal with yourself in certain situations. My goodness, I know my insecurities, I know my faults, I know I'm still that kid who, you know, was shit at rugby and football because I'd never played it, and so simply, wasn't picked. So I've still got that natural aversion to head-to-head competition. If you see me in a pub, I'm normally the quietest guy, and which people cannot believe because I'm also the guy standing on stage in front of, a conference of 800 people. So there's still a homeschooled kid inside me that shies away from if somebody, and I'm a marked man, if I turn up at an event, all people want to do is race me. But I'm still somebody that assumes I'm going to lose that race because as an 11, 12, 13-year-old kid, I was quote unquote shit at sport. I wasn't shit at sport. It was just the things I was passionate about was horse riding and skiing and cycling my bicycle, not hockey, rugby, football, the things I was meant to be doing at that sport. So I think it's fascinating when you grow up and then have your own kids to reflect on the stuff that you become good at, but hopefully more self-aware of, because it certainly gives me the ability to do things with more confidence. But I'm also acutely aware of those formative years and how they shape how I am in those situations, and ultimately how I am as a father with my kids.
So how do you deal with that kind of mindset at times, that negative mindset? Because that's something I've struggled with. Like I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and there's times I'll start a roll with somebody, like the competition side of it, and I'll be immediately thinking, I'm going to lose this. I'm going to lose this. And it's one of those, I don't know, is it maybe like the Scottish negative attitude to things, but we also have that sort of resilient side of it. How did you learn to overcome listening to that sort of autopilot response and know that, yes, I can do this because I've got the reference points. Yes, I've got the great team in place. That, yes, I can do this because I've proved it time and time again. How do you overcome any sort of like negativity like that allows you not to let your daughter grow up with that kind of belief as well?
So, I mean, you know, I'm a huge believer in shoot for the stars, dream big, take on your big ideas. But I'm also a massive fan of, learn your trade, earn your stripes, know what it takes. So, you know, the risk is these days you sort of watch things online on social and you think, I can fall out of bed and do these things. I'm off to climb Everest, row an ocean, cycle around the world. You've got to walk before you run. You've got to know yourself before you can do these truly difficult things. So, I've no idea when you're doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, if you walk into the ring and you know that person has the experience to beat you, whether that is you're defeated simply by that knowledge and you're accepting that you're going to learn a hell of a lot from this situation, or you're just not backing yourself because the internal dialogue until that moment in time hasn't been right. So I think something that endurance athletes get good at is fixating on what they're trying to do. What's important to you? Why do you train? Why do you do Brazilian jiu-jitsu at all? What does it give you that's worthwhile? It doesn't need to be about the level you want to get to, or what competition you want to win, but it has to be about the things that mean to you, something to you in doing that. And then endurance athletes get very, very good at riding the road in front of you. So the period of time that exists between now and then can truncate to nothing. They get endurance athletes are very good at sort of not worrying about the middle ground. And why I think that's really, really useful is because if you're going into a fight or a sparring situation and you're sort of casting your mind forwards to 5-10 minutes down the line and what the outcome is going to be, you're already entirely distracted from what you're doing in that moment. So your defense, your awareness of your body, even the feeling when you hit the mat or take strikes, it's a really intense experience. But if your mind is fasting forwards to the outcome from a combination of events which you've got no awareness of yet, then you've already lost. So endurance athletes, I think, are very good at honing that. I know why I'm doing this. I know where the anchor is further down the road, but all I'm focusing on is the now. And the more that you can control your mind in terms of the what ifs and the period of time that happens between now and then, the more that you enjoy the moment and the more that you control the moment. That lack of control normally becomes from our foresight, and our foresight getting in the way of our focus. And that's it for me. And if you can train that, it doesn't matter. If you end up losing, you'll still have learned more from that process because you've been properly in the moment.
I love that kind of outlook. I mean, do you find that with the businesses that you work with that they focus on the wrong things? Does the sort of the skill set that you've learned during these sort of challenges, does that help you sort of analyze businesses better, do you think? Because you can see where they're focusing on the wrong kind of thing. They're setting up their team wrong, that their processes are wrong.
Yeah, well, yeah,
And does it help you?
yeah, 100%. I mean, most businesses, the classic business, the chief exec sets the strategy for the year, tells the business what he wants to do, which is normally a financial output, and then tells the team that that's really important and cracks the whip. And those numbers stay on the wall as outputs, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. And so very few leadership teams define success KPIs by inputs, behaviors, and what you actually expect people to do every day. That consistency pays off. So that sort of mission statement of a project, be it cycling around the world or growing a business over 1,000 days, or becoming the best you can at Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That sort of mission statement is great because that's the strategy, that's the big picture stuff. Then you've got the bottom up planning around what does that actually look like. Those are inputs, behaviors, day-to-day things which people can actually think about. Especially if I had a team of 40 and I was talking to my mechanic and I said to him 80 days, 80 days, 80 days. 80 days doesn't mean anything to him. Alex, one of my mechanics, turned to me when I was riding out the Gobi Desert from Mongolia to China and said to me on like day 25, he said, "Mark, we're going to do this." And I sort of laughed and I said, "Alex, at what point did you not think we were going to do this?" But there's a real truth within that. Whereas if I'd just been banging on all the time about the 80 days rather than what we actually expected the team to do, then we wouldn't have got the 80 days. So most businesses do exactly the same thing. They tell you what's important in terms of an output without actually defining what they expect people to do in very simple terms.
And you've talked about the times that you've pushed your team into the red during these sort of challenges. Could you just quickly explain about that? Like what does that mean, and how do we push ourselves into the red to achieve our goals when it's needed, and when do we know to back away or to push it, or when's a suitable time to do it? What did it sort of teach you about really stepping up in those kind of moments?
So the only way, so again, going back to the business analogy, a lot of people just ask for more and more and more and more and more. Just, work harder, create more, be more productive, be more profitable. It's the same in sport. Just like keep beating your personal best or beating other people. If you've done bottom up planning properly, if you've actually figured out what should be possible with the resources you've got and the team you've got, then you know what steady state looks like. So, these projects that, I've done 4 expeditions that last over half a year. It's not about smashing it out the park in any given day. It's about what does consistent performance look like over a long period of time. When you get that right, then you can tweak the plan. You can say, right, for the next sort of 6 days, we're going to have to go into the red. We're going to have to, it's going to be unsustainable. And we know it is because we know what steady state looks like. But it's worth it because of X. And, we did that often with the Around the World in 80 Days, going, if we make that flight, that's going to pay dividends. Because if we miss that flight, the next one's 12 hours later, and we're going to be half a day down on schedule or whatever it is. But if we get the earlier flight, we're suddenly, 3/4 of a day up on schedule. So quite often the make or break on those transit points were huge. So I'd say, look, last 6 days in Australia, this is not sustainable. Team, we need you to do more. We're going to ride more, sleep less, but it's for a fixed period of time for a given purpose, and then we're going to go back to steady state. So as long as you set people's, give people clarity around what you're asking them to do and why, then you're not just sort of sitting there going, we want more and more and more and more, and people get burnout and fatigue. You're allowed to set real intensity in your team as long as people know why and as long as they know what steady state looks like. Now, if you set steady state as something which is really difficult, that's fine because at least you set their expectations. It's that lack of clarity and communication which messes with people. It's why brilliant people just get burnout because they don't feel like they've got any control.
That makes a lot of sense because you find in businesses, for example, it's if you do well, they expect more and more. They just keep wanting to go, oh, well, if he can achieve that, what else can he do? And a lot of times that's all team leaders do is they've got targets that are set by somebody. So then they push their guys and their guys push like for other things. And it ends up, like you're saying, you just burn out. And I think that's what a lot of teams struggle with is having somebody that knows when to push, but also when to back away. Um, I mean, what out of everything that you've done? Because I know we're over our time already, and I feel like we're just touching the surface on how much I'm intrigued in the because I actually fell in love with your story, and there's so many avenues I wanted to take this. But before, I would love to have you on again for a round 2. But what are you most proud of? What when you look at it all, is it the camaraderie with your team? Is it cycling around the world? Is it being a father? What if you had to what would you want your legacy to be?
It's a big question. Crikey. I mean, I'm only 37, so ask me in a few years' time. Um, it's not answering the question, but if somebody offered me, 50 million quid, would I change what I've done in the last 15 years? And the answer is no. So I've made mistakes. I've failed at a number of expeditions. I've had things which are regrettable, but I'm not somebody who actually regrets anything. It's all been pretty tough, interesting, but I've made a lot of friends and I've made very few enemies. So on balance, I'm happy. I'm what do I want my legacy to be? You know, family's at the heart of everything. I sort of split life into three spheres: work, community, and family. And it's so easy to get focused on one or two of them without actually creating an impact on all three. But for every period of my life, and so, during lockdown is a great example. Take the last 12 weeks as an example. As long as you've touched each of those three spheres in a purposeful way, you've had a plan. How am I going to make a difference in my work, in my family, and in my community? You know, that'll give you a sense of sort of happiness, mental sanity. I mean, you asked what I want my legacy to be. I mean, that's about what other people think of me.
Mm.
Maybe we're finishing this conversation where we started. Maybe I should care more about what other people think. But maybe it's that homeschooled boy surrounded by goats and sheep and chickens and hens. I maybe
Because it probably would stop you being you.
I've maybe never spent a mass amount of time worrying about what other people think.
And I think that's what makes you such a remarkable guy and like such a likable guy is that because you don't. And I always like because I started asking that question because I found it difficult to kind of explain to myself what I want my legacy to be. I just wanted to be live happy and have some great experiences and be like have kids and stuff like that. I found it difficult to kind of answer. So I was always interested to see what other people thought. And it's like you're saying, it's what other people think of you or like how people would sum you up rather than how you would want it. Um, I mean, it's a very difficult question, and you've done some amazing things. But do you think you always feel like that Scottish lad from the farm? Is that the story that we tell ourselves? Do you think that that's the best thing? Is never to lose who we truly are?
Oh, for sure. You're kidding yourself if you lose that, and you shouldn't try to. I mean, we're all allowed to move away from home and do different things, but you never lose where you've come from. That sense of home is always there. And I mean, there's a lot of zero to hero stories, and there's a lot of rags to riches stories. I'd encourage people to read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell because it redefines why people end up doing quote unquote extraordinary things. And it's nobody's an island. Nobody does things themselves. You don't achieve anything in life without the right environment, support, mentors, opportunities. So nothing is an accident. So the classic Western, by that Western I mean sort of like, us Brits and Americans are great at sort of, the self-made stories. And there's a bit more truth to it than that, isn't there? So at the heart of your question, will I always be that homeschooled lad, who grew up, in rural Perthshire and then went off to? Yes, of course. But I was also given, you know, amazing support from my mum, access and confidence from an early age to go on adventures, and there's certain things which were massively formative in who I am. And I think the more we think about those things, the more we can sort of help and shape, the next generation as well. And that's at the heart of your question. That's kind of the most important thing as well, isn't it? If I could bottle some of the moments I've had on expeditions and share them with my kids, I'd be very happy.
Because when I look back and I think like the way we were brought up, like by my mother, is a kind of you can achieve what you want, you can decide what you want to go and how you if you want to do X, go and do X. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Mm.
Like she gave us the skill sets to go and do it and to decide what we wanted from life. And I think that's the problem is we sometimes lose what made us special, that uniqueness, and that's a loss to the world if you do that kind of thing. I
Yeah,
mean, I know we're way over time,
and I think
Oh, sorry.
I think the comparative success is a dangerous one because there's X billion people in the world. Where are we? 7, 8 billion people. You're not going to be the absolute at anything, and you don't need to try to be. Happiness and contentment and fulfillment, is a very personal thing. It shouldn't be a comparative thing. And social media and media at large is important, but as long as you can take it with a massive pinch of salt and realize the things that sort of equate to happiness and fulfillment will come much much closer to home than those sort of distance reference points. Um, so yeah, there's a ton in that as well. I should also mention, because he has inspired my recent sort of project with my daughter. It was Ricky Gates was the guy that did the Every Street project. If people wanted to go back and look that one up, and to give another plug to, you were talking before about why you got into podcasting and your inspiration and wanting to you know uncover some of these stories. And I've got a friend up here in Edinburgh who does a great job with a podcast called Get After It with Alan Nash. And, very similar passion to yourself, in terms of just trying to understand and unpack life stories. And, I think you're doing a fantastic job, here. And if people want to listen to sort of other material, that's definitely one I would promote, because those things you listen to, and podcasting is a great way of doing it, always give you ideas and quiet confidence to take on your own ideas.
Because I think that's a great kind of show to listen to, is one that you can sit, put the headphones on, chill away from it in that quiet moment from work or as you're traveling back and forth. And it just inspires you. It's like that person speaking solely, well, it is, but, speaking directly to you and inspiring you. And you don't have to worry about somebody laughing at you in school or being judged, and you can then pick a challenge that you want to do in your own spare time and then build it from there. And like you're saying, go from one expedition to the next expedition, and look where it took you. It took you around the world,
Yeah.
and the amazing stuff that you've done. And now you're passing those skills and that kind of viewpoint on to your kids, who are then going to pass it on to the future generations. And I think that's what makes the world such a brilliant place. Like my mum taught us to go out and try to view life and push yourself and, get the most you can from it, but also to kind of build the relationships and get connections with people and all that kind of stuff. And it's amazing when you see somebody like that, but then also what you build and give, like one of your key components is to build that community and do it. And I think you're doing a
Yeah.
fabulous job from it.
Yeah, the community side's massively important. And modern society has done its best to sort of break those links, the intergenerational links and the close community links. And I think as you grow older, that's the thing that you grow closer to again. And yeah, that's a great place to finish, because ultimately, you could do a podcast with me and it's all about going out there solo and smashing it and going around the world and ultimately trying to figure out what you're capable of. And it's a very sort of, that sounds like a very alpha ego story, whereas really, for me, it's always been about the storytelling. It's always been about the people around me. It's always been about, I love nothing more than when people come back and tell me what they've done off the back of reading a book or being a part of something that I've done. That's such a positive feedback loop, fire in the belly. So I think that's where podcasting is so powerful, because we lose that in edited television, we lose that in radio, which again is so closely edited and scripted, so and time constrained. So these long form conversations are kind of like the old chats in the pub that so many of us just don't have anymore, and they're really formative. And yeah, I hope people have enjoyed this ramble. We've been at it for a while, so I hope people have got something out of it.
I mean, it's definitely what you're saying is true. You have to learn from the stories. It's like what your grandpa told you, what your dad tells you, all this kind of things. But for people listening, I mean, what do you want them to take from this? What would you like the sort of the go home message to be?
Um, to back yourself, to not in a happy clappy positivity way. We all have good days and bad days, but just back yourself. Just have that quiet confidence. Don't wait for life to give you opportunities. That for me is far more important than being being book smart or you know there's always going to be reasons not to do things. If you've got an idea, I'm all for being a dreamer, but the power of actually turning some of those into actions, doing them, making mistakes, having fun, is just the spice of life. So yeah, I'm not one for big positive mental attitude chats, because I just don't think that's the way the world works. Some days you wake up in bed and you just can't be bothered. But for me, it's just about have that fire in the belly, have that quiet confidence. Don't mind a bit of suffering, get out there and do fun stuff.
Well, I would love to do another one at some point to, go on about the planning, the training, all that kind of stuff. But for those who want to find out more, check out the books and watch the documentaries, find out the charity stuff you're doing just now, because you're raising such an amazing amount of money for some amazing charities. How can we keep track of you? How can we connect on social media, your website, that sort of thing?
It's pretty easy to find me. If you Google Mark Beaumont, you'll find all of the above. So Mark Beaumont online is the website. Mr. Mark Beaumont across social media platforms, and if you go on any channels like YouTube or Global Cycling Network, you'll find a lot of films and content out there as well.
Well, that's it for another week, and thank you for listening. It's now time to take what you've learned and use it to develop and enhance your life with the key points mentioned. Listen, try it, embrace it, use it, and crush it. Now's your time to hit that next level in your life. If you liked this episode, then please leave a comment on the show notes or a review of the show on your podcast platform. Everything helps evolve the show. Until next week, keep seeking the next level in your life.